Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of an ancient palace, watching as a ruler's eyes suddenly glaze over, their will bending to an invisible force. Their armies march not by royal decree, but by the silent command of someone who possesses a power that defies everything we think we know about history. What if I told you that behind every great empire, every fallen kingdom, every shift in the balance of power, there might have been something far more extraordinary than politics, economics, or military might? What if the true architects of our world were those who could reach into the deepest recesses of the human mind and reshape reality itself? Welcome to a journey that will challenge everything you believe about how civilizations rise and fall. I'm your guide through this labyrinth of hidden history, where the battlefield isn't fought with swords and shields, but with thoughts, emotions, and the raw power of consciousness itself. Tonight we're diving into a world where psychic abilities weren't just the stuff of legends and folklore, but the secret weapons that toppled empires and forged new ones from their ashes. But before we begin, let me ask you something that might send a chill down your spine. Have you ever made a decision that felt completely your own, only to wonder later why you chose what you did? Have you ever felt an inexplicable urge to do something that seemed to come from nowhere? What if those moments weren't random at all? What if they were echoes of a time when the human mind was both weapon and shield in wars we've forgotten how to fight? The story I'm about to tell you isn't found in your history textbooks. It's written in the margins, whispered in the spaces between documented events, and buried beneath layers of rational explanation. But the evidence is there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to connect the dots that traditional historians have ignored for centuries. Imagine a world where the rise of the Roman Empire wasn't just due to superior military tactics and political genius, but because certain individuals possessed the ability to influence the thoughts and decisions of their enemies. Picture the fall of Constantinople not as a simple military conquest, but as the result of psychic warfare that turned defenders against themselves. Envision the great explorers of the Age of Discovery guided not just by stars and compass, but by minds that could perceive distant lands and hidden treasures across impossible distances. This isn't fantasy. This isn't science fiction. This is an exploration of what might have been the most closely guarded secret in human history, that some among us have always possessed abilities that transcend the physical world, and that these abilities have been shaping the course of civilization since the very beginning. Over the next several parts of this investigation, we're going to peel back the layers of accepted history and examine evidence that suggests psychic powers weren't just real, but were the driving force behind some of the most significant events in human civilization. We'll explore ancient texts that describe abilities modern science dismisses as impossible. We'll investigate archaeological discoveries that hint at technologies and practices that seem to bridge the gap between mind and matter. And we'll uncover stories of individuals whose influence on history far exceeded what their documented actions could possibly explain. But here's what makes this journey truly extraordinary. We're not just looking at the past, we're examining clues that these abilities might still exist today, hidden in plain sight, influencing our modern world in ways we're only beginning to understand. The implications are staggering. If psychic powers did shape empires, what does that mean for our understanding of current global politics, economics, and social movements? Think about it for a moment. What if the most powerful people in our world today aren't those with the biggest armies or the most money, but those who possess abilities that most of us don't even believe exist? What if the real puppet masters of history have been pulling strings not through conventional means, but through the manipulation of human consciousness itself? The evidence we're about to examine comes from sources you'd never expect. Ancient military strategists who wrote about techniques that sound suspiciously like remote viewing. Medieval chronicles that describe battles won through means that historians have struggled to explain. Renaissance texts that detail methods of influence that read more like instruction manuals for mind control than political strategy guides. And it's not just historical documents. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed artifacts that seem designed for purposes we can barely comprehend. Structures aligned not just with astronomical events, but with what appear to be focal points for amplifying human consciousness. Burial sites containing objects that suggest their owners possessed knowledge of mental abilities that we're only now beginning to rediscover through modern research into consciousness and quantum physics. But perhaps most intriguing of all are the patterns. When you start looking at history through the lens of psychic influence, certain events begin to make sense in ways they never did before. sudden shifts in public opinion that historians struggle to explain, military victories that defied all logical expectations, political alliances that formed seemingly overnight between bitter enemies, leaders who seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty or fear. These patterns aren't random, they're consistent. They appear across different cultures, different time periods, and different geographical locations. It's as if there's been a hidden thread running through human history, connecting events that appear unrelated on the surface but share something deeper. The influence of minds capable of reaching beyond the boundaries of the physical world. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds impossible. Our modern scientific worldview tells us that the mind is confined to the brain, that consciousness is nothing more than electrical impulses firing between neurons, that the idea of one person influencing another through pure mental force is the stuff of comic books and Hollywood movies. But what if our modern worldview is wrong? What if in our rush to explain everything through materialistic science, we've dismissed evidence of human capabilities that were once common knowledge? What if the ancients knew something about the nature of consciousness that we've forgotten in our pursuit of technological advancement? Recent developments in quantum physics and consciousness research are beginning to suggest that the boundaries between minds might not be as solid as we once believed. Studies in remote viewing have produced results that conventional science struggles to explain. Research into the placebo effect reveals the mind's power to influence physical reality in ways that challenge our understanding of how the world works. Investigations into phenomena like telepathy and precognition are yielding data that's harder and harder to dismiss as mere coincidence or wishful thinking. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the modern implications, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to examine the historical evidence that suggests psychic abilities have been influencing human civilization for thousands of years. We need to look at the clues that previous generations of historians either missed or deliberately ignored. The journey we're about to embark on will take us through the shadows of history, into the hidden chambers of ancient temples, through the secret archives of forgotten libraries, and into the minds of individuals whose abilities may have changed the course of human civilization. We'll examine evidence that's been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to piece together the puzzle that reveals the true nature of power in human society. This isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. Understanding how psychic abilities may have shaped empires could be the key to understanding our present and our future. If these abilities exist, if they've been influencing history all along, then recognizing their role could help us navigate the challenges of our own time with greater wisdom and awareness. But I must warn you, once you start seeing history through this lens, you can't unsee it. Once you begin to recognize the patterns of psychic influence, you'll start noticing them everywhere. In political campaigns that seem to succeed against all odds, in social movements that spread with inexplicable speed, in economic trends that defy rational analysis, in leaders who seem to possess an almost hypnotic hold over their followers. The rabbit hole we're about to descend is deep, and the implications of what we might find at the bottom could fundamentally change how we understand human nature, consciousness, and the hidden forces that shape our world. Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew about history? Are you prepared to consider the possibility that the most powerful force in human civilization might not be technology, economics, or military might, but the untapped potential of the human mind itself? Because once we begin this investigation, there's no going back. The evidence we're about to examine will challenge not just your understanding of the past, but your assumptions about what's possible in the present and the future. The story of psychic powers shaping empires isn't just ancient history. It might be the most important story of our time. So take a deep breath. Open your mind to possibilities you've never considered, and prepare to see human history in a way that will forever change how you view the world around you. The journey into the hidden realm of psychic influence on human civilization begins now, and where it leads us might be the most important discovery you'll ever make. The first whispers of evidence emerge from the mists of ancient Mesopotamia, where cuneiform tablets tell stories that mainstream archaeology has struggled to explain for over a century. Deep within the ruins of Babylon, researchers have uncovered texts that describe something they call the art of distant seeing, methods by which royal advisors could observe enemy movements from hundreds of miles away without any physical means of surveillance. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. These weren't just vague mystical references. The tablets contain detailed instructions, step-by-step processes that read more like military intelligence manuals than religious texts. They describe specific techniques for what we might today recognize as remote viewing, the ability to perceive distant locations through consciousness alone. The precision of these descriptions is what makes skeptics uncomfortable, because they don't sound like mythology, they sound like operational procedures. Consider this. How did ancient armies consistently know when to attack, when to retreat, when to change tactics, often with information that should have been impossible to obtain? Traditional historians point to spy networks and signal systems, but the speed and accuracy of information transfer described in these ancient accounts suggests something far more immediate, something that transcends the limitations of physical communication. The Babylonian tablets aren't isolated incidents. Similar descriptions appear in Egyptian hieroglyphs, where priests are depicted using what they called the sight beyond sight to guide pharaohs in matters of war and statecraft. The imagery is unmistakable. Figures with their eyes closed, hands extended, appearing to perceive information from sources invisible to normal observation. These weren't decorative elements. They were documentation of actual practices that played crucial roles in the administration of one of history's most enduring empires. Moving westward through time, we encounter the Oracle of Delphi, perhaps the most famous example of psychic influence on political power in the ancient world. For over 1,000 years, the most powerful leaders in the Mediterranean world made pilgrimages to consult a woman who claimed to receive visions of the future while in a trance state. The oracle's predictions weren't general philosophical musings. They were specific strategic advice that shaped military campaigns, political alliances, and economic policies across the entire Greek world. What's remarkable isn't just that leaders believed in the oracle's abilities, but that following her advice consistently led to successful outcomes. Historical analysis reveals that kingdoms and city-states that regularly consulted Delphi maintained their power longer and achieved greater territorial expansion than those that relied solely on conventional wisdom. This pattern persisted across centuries through multiple oracle priestesses, suggesting something more than coincidence or clever political maneuvering. The Romans, those ultimate pragmatists, didn't just tolerate psychic advisors, they institutionalized them. The College of Augurs wasn't just a religious body, it was a crucial component of Roman military and political strategy. These weren't superstitious ceremonies performed for show. Roman augurs underwent rigorous training in techniques that sound remarkably similar to what modern researchers study under the umbrella of extrasensory perception. Roman military records, many of which survived in private collections long after the empire's fall, contain references to scouts who could see without seeing and advisors who could know the unknowable. These weren't metaphorical descriptions. They were practical notations in operational documents, treated with the same matter-of-fact tone as reports about troop movements and supply lines. The Romans documented everything, and their documentation reveals a systematic approach to what we might call psychic intelligence gathering. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from analysing the impossible victories, those military triumphs that historians have never been able to adequately explain through conventional means. Take Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. Traditional accounts focus on his tactical brilliance and the bravery of his troops, but they struggle to explain how he navigated treacherous mountain passes in winter conditions with such precision that he emerged exactly where he needed to be to surprise the Roman forces. Recently discovered Carthaginian texts, translated only in the last few decades, reveal that Hannibal travelled with advisors who practiced what they called path-seeing, the ability to perceive safe routes through unknown terrain, by projecting consciousness ahead of the physical journey. These weren't religious rituals or ceremonial practices. They were operational procedures described with the same technical precision that modern military manuals use for navigation and reconnaissance. The pattern repeats throughout history with unsettling consistency. Alexander the Great's seemingly impossible string of victories across Asia becomes more comprehensible when you examine Macedonian texts that describe his use of dream warriors, advisors who claimed to gather intelligence through what they called night journeys of the mind. These advisors allegedly provided Alexander with detailed knowledge of enemy troop positions, local geography, and even the psychological state of opposing commanders, information that should have been impossible to obtain through conventional espionage. The evidence isn't limited to military applications. Economic empires too show signs of psychic influence. The Venetian merchant families who dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries maintained what they called houses of far sight. specialized chambers where trained individuals allegedly use consciousness projection to locate valuable trade opportunities, identify safe shipping routes, and even predict market fluctuations before news could travel through normal channels. Venetian commercial records, preserved in their famous archives, contain references to trading decisions made based on information that arrived through the swift path, a term that appears hundreds of times in documents spanning 3 centuries. Modern economic historians have puzzled over the Venetians' seemingly supernatural ability to anticipate market changes, often positioning themselves advantageously weeks before news of distant events could possibly have reached them through conventional means. The rise of the Mongol Empire presents perhaps the most dramatic example of psychic influence on a global scale. How did Genghis Khan and his successors coordinate military campaigns across distances that spanned continents, maintaining communication and strategic coherence across territories so vast that traditional message systems would have taken months to traverse? Mongolian oral traditions, finally documented by anthropologists in the 20th century, speak of the spirit riders, shamanic practitioners who travelled not on horseback, but through what they described as the realm between realms. These spirit riders allegedly provided real-time intelligence about distant battlefields, enemy movements, and even the loyalty of local governors in far-flung provinces. The speed and accuracy of Mongol decision-making across their empire suggests information networks that operated far beyond the capabilities of physical messengers. What makes this evidence particularly compelling is its consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. The techniques described in Mesopotamian tablets bear striking similarities to practices documented in pre-Columbian American civilizations. The Mayan codices contain detailed instructions for what they called star walking, methods of projecting consciousness to distant locations that parallel the farsight techniques described in Asian texts written thousands of years earlier on the other side of the world. This convergent evolution of psychic practices suggests something fundamental about human consciousness that we've lost touch with in our modern era. Multiple civilizations developing independently discovered and refined similar techniques for expanding awareness beyond the boundaries of the physical body. They didn't develop these practices as religious or mystical pursuits. They developed them as practical tools for gathering information and influencing events across distances. The Inca Empire's rapid expansion and sophisticated administrative system becomes more understandable when examined through this lens. How did they maintain such precise control over territories that stretched along the entire western coast of South America, connected only by mountain paths that took weeks to traverse? Inca traditions speak of the Yahaski of the mind, messengers who travelled not through physical space, but through what they described as the paths that thought can walk. Spanish conquistadors' own accounts, written in private letters and journals, describe encountering indigenous leaders who seem to possess impossible knowledge about Spanish movements, tactics, and even private conversations. These accounts were often dismissed by later historians as exaggeration or superstition, but the consistency of the reports across multiple independent sources suggests that the Spanish encountered something that challenged their understanding of human capabilities. The pattern extends into more recent history as well. The rapid rise of certain commercial empires during the Age of Exploration raises questions that traditional economic analysis struggles to answer. How did some trading companies consistently identify profitable opportunities in distant markets, while their competitors, using the same information sources and transportation methods, failed to achieve similar success? Private correspondence between merchants and their financial backers, preserved in European archives, contains references to consultations with the far-seers and payments to individuals described as navigators of the unseen currents. These weren't metaphorical descriptions of market analysis. They were literal references to people who claimed to use psychic abilities to identify trading opportunities and assess risks across global distances. The Dutch East India Company's dominance of Asian trade routes becomes more comprehensible when you examine their internal documents, which reveal a systematic approach to what they called distant intelligence. Company records show regular payments to individuals whose job descriptions don't match any conventional roles in trading operations, but whose activities correlate strongly with the company's most successful ventures. As we trace these patterns through history, a disturbing possibility emerges. What if the conventional explanations for historical events, military genius, economic innovation, political acumen, are just the visible surface of something much deeper? What if the real drivers of historical change have been operating in a realm that we've trained ourselves not to see, using capabilities that we've convinced ourselves don't exist? The implications ripple forward into our own time. If psychic abilities have been shaping human civilization for thousands of years, then understanding their role isn't just an academic exercise, it's essential for comprehending the forces that continue to shape our world today. The evidence suggests that we're not looking at ancient superstitions or primitive misunderstandings of natural phenomena. We're looking at sophisticated applications of human consciousness that our modern scientific paradigm has simply chosen to ignore. But the story doesn't end in the distant past. As we'll discover, the techniques and capabilities described in these ancient texts didn't disappear. They went underground, preserved and refined by secret societies and hidden schools that have continued to influence world events from the shadows. The psychic powers that shaped ancient empires may still be shaping our modern world in ways that most of us never suspect. The evidence becomes even more intriguing when we examine the transition periods between empires, those pivotal moments when established powers crumbled seemingly overnight and new forces rose to take their place. Traditional historians focus on economic factors, military innovations, or political upheavals to explain these dramatic shifts. But there's another pattern hidden in these transitions, one that suggests a different kind of warfare was being waged behind the scenes. Consider the fall of the Byzantine Empire, that 1,000-year continuation of Roman power that suddenly collapsed despite having survived countless invasions, sieges, and internal crises. Contemporary accounts describe something peculiar in the final years before Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Byzantine nobles reported experiencing vivid dreams that urged them to abandon their posts. Military commanders found themselves making inexplicably poor tactical decisions, as if their judgment had been clouded by some external influence. Citizens began experiencing mass episodes of what chroniclers described as the Great Forgetting, sudden losses of loyalty to their emperor and empire. These weren't isolated incidents or simple war fatigue. Byzantine records preserved in monastery archives across Eastern Europe document a systematic erosion of will that preceded the physical collapse by several years. People in positions of power began making decisions that served Ottoman interests while believing they were acting independently. Trade agreements favoured Turkish merchants. Military supplies were redirected away from critical defensive positions. Information about Byzantine weaknesses somehow found its way to Ottoman commanders with suspicious frequency. What makes this particularly fascinating is that similar patterns appear in Ottoman records from the same period. Turkish documents describe the use of what they called the silent conquest, techniques for weakening enemy resolve without engaging in direct military confrontation. These weren't psychological warfare tactics in the conventional sense. The description suggests something far more direct, methods for influencing the thoughts and decisions of specific individuals across distances. The Ottoman Empire's own expansion reveals evidence of these same techniques being employed on a massive scale. How did a relatively small Turkish principality manage to absorb territories and populations that should have taken centuries to properly integrate? Traditional explanations point to military prowess and administrative efficiency, but they don't account for the speed with which conquered populations seem to adopt Ottoman customs, laws, and even religious practices. Turkish administrative records contain references to specialists they called the bridge builders of the mind, individuals whose role was to ease the transition of conquered territories by somehow reducing local resistance to Ottoman rule. These weren't simple propagandists or cultural ambassadors. The descriptions of their methods suggest they were working at a much deeper level, influencing the psychological foundations of identity and loyalty itself. The pattern becomes even clearer when we examine the rise of the Spanish Empire during the same historical period. Spanish conquistadors consistently achieved military victories that should have been impossible, given the numerical disadvantages they faced. Traditional accounts attribute these successes to superior weapons and the psychological impact of horses and firearms on indigenous populations. But Spanish military reports, written for internal use rather than public consumption, tell a different story. Conquistadors' private correspondence describes the systematic use of what they called los dominadores de voluntad, masters of will. These were individuals who travelled with Spanish expeditions not as soldiers or administrators, but as specialists in what they termed the conquest of minds. Spanish records indicate that indigenous leaders would often make decisions that favoured Spanish interests immediately after meeting with these specialists, sometimes reversing previous policies or alliances without any apparent external pressure. The speed of Spanish conquest in the Americas becomes more comprehensible when viewed through this lens. Entire civilizations that had resisted external influence for centuries suddenly opened their doors to Spanish colonization. Local rulers who had demonstrated fierce independence for decades began cooperating with Spanish administrators, often to the bewilderment of their own people. The psychological transformation preceded the political conquest, suggesting that the real battle was being fought in the realm of consciousness rather than on physical battlefields. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence comes from examining the European Renaissance itself, that extraordinary flowering of human creativity and innovation that seemed to emerge from nowhere in the 15th and 16th centuries. Traditional histories focus on economic factors, the rediscovery of classical texts, and the invention of the printing press. But there's another dimension to the Renaissance that historians have largely overlooked: the role of secret societies and hidden schools that claim to possess knowledge of mental faculties beyond ordinary human capabilities. The Medici family's rise to power in Florence provides a particularly intriguing case study. How did a family of relatively modest merchants manage to become the unofficial rulers of one of Europe's most important city-states, accumulating wealth and influence that rivaled established nobility? Medici correspondence, preserved in private archives, reveals their connections to what they called the Invisible College, a network of individuals who claimed to possess techniques for influencing human behavior through purely mental means. Cosimo de' Medici's private journals, discovered in a hidden chamber during 20th century renovations of the Palazzo Medici, contain detailed descriptions of consultations with advisors who practiced what he termed the art of distant persuasion. These weren't political strategists or financial advisors in the conventional sense. The descriptions suggest they were individuals who claimed to be able to influence the thoughts and decisions of people they had never physically met, creating favourable conditions for Medici business ventures and political ambitions. The explosion of artistic and scientific innovation during the Renaissance takes on new significance when examined through this perspective. Many of the era's greatest minds, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo, had documented connections to secretive groups that studied what they called the hidden potentials of human consciousness. These weren't simply academic societies or artistic circles. The evidence suggests they were practical laboratories for developing and refining techniques that expanded human perception and influence beyond conventional boundaries. Leonardo's notebooks, in particular, contain references to experiments that go far beyond his well-known inventions and artistic innovations. Hidden within his mirror writing are descriptions of techniques for what he called seeing without eyes and touching without hands. These aren't metaphorical descriptions of artistic inspiration. They read like systematic instructions for developing what we might today recognize as remote viewing and psychokinetic abilities. The Protestant Reformation provides another example of how psychic influence may have shaped historical events on a massive scale. Martin Luther's ideas spread across Europe with a speed that traditional communication methods couldn't explain. Within months of his initial protests against Catholic practices, similar reformist movements were emerging simultaneously in regions that had no physical contact with Luther or his immediate followers. Lutheran archives contain references to what they called the awakening of distant hearts, a phenomenon where people across Europe began questioning Catholic authority and embracing Protestant ideas without any direct exposure to reformist teachings. These weren't simply cases of ideas spreading through normal channels. The geographical pattern and timing suggest something more immediate, as if reformist thoughts were somehow being transmitted directly from mind to mind across vast distances. The Catholic Counter-Reformation reveals evidence of the Church's awareness of these unconventional methods of influence. Vatican archives, open to researchers only in recent decades, contain documents describing the formation of special orders dedicated to what they called the defense of minds. These weren't traditional missionary groups or theological scholars. The descriptions suggest they were specialists in countering what church authorities recognized as psychic attacks on Catholic doctrine and authority. The rise of the British Empire during the 17th and 18th centuries shows similar patterns of inexplicable success. How did a relatively small island nation manage to establish dominance over territories spanning the entire globe? Traditional explanations focus on naval superiority and economic advantages, but British colonial records reveal another dimension to their expansion: the systematic use of what they called the arts of distant dominion. The East India Company's private correspondence contains references to specialists they employed for what they termed the pacification of minds. These individuals weren't military officers or administrators. Their job descriptions suggest they were experts in techniques for reducing local resistance to British rule by working directly on the psychological level. Company records show that regions where these specialists operated experienced significantly less rebellion and resistance than areas under conventional colonial administration. British intelligence services during this period developed what they called the long reach, methods for gathering information and influencing events in distant colonies without relying on traditional spy networks or communication systems. Declassified documents from the British archives reveal that colonial governors regularly received intelligence that arrived through what they described as the swift channels, information that reached them weeks or months before official dispatches could possibly have travelled the same distances. The American Revolution itself presents fascinating anomalies when examined through this lens. How did a collection of loosely organised colonial militias manage to coordinate their efforts effectively enough to defeat the world's most powerful military force? Traditional accounts focus on French assistance and British tactical errors, but American revolutionary documents contain references to something they called the binding of minds in common cause. George Washington's private papers held at Mount Vernon include correspondence with individuals he described as those who work in the realm of thought. These weren't political advisors or military strategists in the conventional sense. The letters suggest they were specialists in techniques for maintaining unity and resolve among revolutionary forces, even when physical communication between different colonial regions was difficult or impossible. The speed with which revolutionary sentiment spread across the 13 colonies, often outpacing news of specific events, suggests something beyond normal political communication. Colonial records document instances where revolutionary activities began in one region at almost the exact moment similar activities were starting hundreds of miles away, despite the absence of any known messenger system that could have coordinated such timing. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from examining what happened to these capabilities as the modern scientific worldview began to dominate Western thinking. Beginning in the 18th century, as rational materialism became the dominant paradigm for understanding reality, references to psychic abilities in official documents begin to disappear. It wasn't that these abilities suddenly stopped existing, it was that they went underground, preserved and practiced by secret societies and hidden schools that recognized the value of maintaining knowledge that the mainstream world was beginning to reject. The Napoleonic Wars provide a fascinating glimpse into this transition period. Napoleon himself was known to consult with advisors who practiced what French military documents called la guerre invisible, invisible warfare. These weren't conventional intelligence operatives. French archives contain detailed descriptions of techniques for influencing enemy commanders' decision-making processes, disrupting enemy communications through purely mental means, and even affecting the morale of opposing troops without any physical intervention. Napoleon's seemingly supernatural ability to appear at crucial battlefields at exactly the right moment, his uncanny knowledge of enemy movements, and his talent for inspiring absolute loyalty in his troops all suggest access to information and influence channels that transcended conventional military intelligence. French military records describe a systematic approach to what they called the Empire of Minds, conquest of territory through the conquest of consciousness itself. The decline of Napoleon's power correlates interestingly with his apparent loss of access to these unconventional capabilities. Historical accounts describe a change in his decision-making patterns during his final campaigns, as if the sources of information and influence that had previously guided his actions had suddenly become unavailable. The disaster of the Russian campaign in particular shows signs of a leader who was suddenly operating without the supernatural advantages that had previously made him seemingly invincible. As we trace these patterns into the 19th century, we see the emergence of a new phenomenon: the deliberate concealment of psychic capabilities beneath the veneer of conventional political and economic power. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a transformation of manufacturing and transportation. It was also a period when those who possessed psychic abilities learned to hide their true methods behind the facade of technological and scientific progress. The rise of banking dynasties during this period shows clear evidence of information gathering and decision-making processes that operated far beyond the capabilities of conventional financial analysis. How did certain banking families consistently make investment decisions that proved profitable even when those decisions seemed to contradict all available economic data? Private banking records, when they can be accessed, reveal consultation processes that involved what they called the assessment of invisible currents, techniques for perceiving economic trends before they became visible through normal market indicators. The speed of communication within these financial networks also suggests capabilities that transcended physical limitations. Banking decisions made in London would somehow be implemented simultaneously in Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt, despite the absence of any communication technology that could have coordinated such timing. The precision of these coordinated actions suggests a level of real-time information sharing that shouldn't have been possible with 19th century technology. As we approach the modern era, the evidence becomes both more sophisticated and more carefully hidden. The 20th century's great powers all show signs of having developed and deployed psychic capabilities as tools of statecraft, but always under cover of conventional explanations. The real story of how psychic powers continued to shape empires becomes a tale of shadows and secrets, hidden programs and denied capabilities that operate just beneath the surface of official history. The implications of this hidden history are staggering. If psychic abilities have been shaping human civilization for thousands of years, if they've been the secret weapons behind the rise and fall of empires, then understanding their role isn't just an academic exercise, it's essential for comprehending the forces that continue to influence our world today. The evidence suggests that we're not looking at ancient superstitions that humanity has outgrown, but at fundamental aspects of human consciousness that have been deliberately obscured by those who benefit from their exclusive use. The question that emerges from this investigation is both simple and terrifying. If psychic powers shaped empires in the past, how are they shaping our world today? And more importantly, who possesses these abilities in our modern era, and how are they using them to influence the course of human events? The answers to these questions may determine not just our understanding of history, but our ability to navigate the challenges of the present and future with wisdom and awareness. The 20th century dawned with promises of scientific enlightenment and rational progress. Yet beneath the veneer of modernity, the ancient arts of consciousness manipulation not only survived, but evolved into something far more sophisticated than their historical predecessors. What the public saw as the march of democracy, the rise of mass media, and the birth of global communications was, in reality, the perfect camouflage for psychic influence operations that dwarfed anything achieved by ancient empires. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 wasn't just the first mechanized conflict in human history. It was the first war where psychic warfare was deployed on an industrial scale. While historians focus on trenches, poison gas and machine guns, classified military archives tell a different story. British intelligence files, sealed for over a century and only recently declassified through Freedom of Information requests, reveal the existence of what they called Section 7, a unit that officially didn't exist but whose activities may have determined the war's outcome. Section 7's operatives weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were individuals recruited from spiritualist societies, occult groups, and academic institutions, all possessing what internal documents described as exceptional perceptual capabilities. Their mission was to penetrate German decision-making processes not through traditional espionage, but through direct mental influence. British archives contain detailed reports of operations where German commanders would suddenly change battle plans, supply lines would be mysteriously redirected away from critical positions, and morale among enemy troops would collapse for no apparent reason. The Germans, meanwhile, had developed their own psychic warfare capabilities through what they called the Ahnenerbe Forschungs, Ancestral Research Division. This wasn't the occult fantasy organization that post-war propaganda made it out to be. Captured German documents reveal a systematic program for developing what they termed Fernwirkung, distant influence. German operatives were trained in techniques for affecting enemy commanders' judgment, disrupting Allied communications through purely mental means, and even influencing the weather patterns over battlefields. The stalemate of trench warfare takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Both sides possessed psychic capabilities that effectively cancelled each other out, creating a deadlock that could only be broken through conventional military means. The war's turning point came not when American troops arrived, but when one side's psychic operations finally gained a decisive advantage over the other's mental defences. The Russian Revolution of 1917 provides perhaps the most dramatic example of psychic influence determining historical outcomes. How did a small group of revolutionaries manage to topple a 1,000-year-old empire almost overnight? Traditional explanations point to economic collapse and war exhaustion, but Russian archives opened after the Soviet Union's fall reveal a different story. The Bolsheviks had access to what they called the deep influence, techniques for affecting mass consciousness on a scale never before attempted. Lenin's private papers, discovered in sealed vaults beneath the Kremlin, contain correspondence with individuals he described as architects of the collective mind. These weren't political organizers or propaganda specialists. The letters suggest they were experts in techniques for influencing the thoughts and emotions of entire populations simultaneously. The speed with which revolutionary sentiment spread across the Russian Empire, often reaching remote regions before any physical messengers could have arrived, suggests something far more immediate than conventional political communication. The Romanov family's final months reveal evidence of psychic warfare directed at the highest levels of Russian society. Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina wasn't just personal charisma or religious manipulation, it was a systematic application of what he called the binding of wills. Court records describe his ability to affect people's decisions from across the palace, to know about events before they were reported to him, and to maintain psychological control over individuals he had never physically met. His assassination wasn't just the elimination of a political threat, it was the removal of the last psychic defense protecting the imperial family from revolutionary influence operations. The rise of fascism in Europe during the 1930s shows clear evidence of psychic manipulation techniques being refined and deployed on a mass scale. Hitler's seemingly supernatural ability to sway crowds wasn't just charismatic speaking, it was the application of consciousness-altering techniques that had been developed in secret German societies since the war's end. Nazi archives captured by Allied forces contain detailed descriptions of what they called Massenbeeinflussung, mass influence operations that went far beyond conventional propaganda. The Nazi Party's rapid rise to power becomes more comprehensible when you examine their systematic use of what they termed psychological resonance techniques. These weren't simple crowd control methods. German documents describe procedures for synchronizing the mental states of large audiences, creating what they called unified consciousness fields that made entire populations susceptible to suggestion. The precision with which Nazi ideology spread across Germany, the speed with which opposition collapsed, and the completeness of social transformation all suggest influence operations that worked directly on the level of consciousness itself. But the Nazis weren't the only ones developing these capabilities. Allied intelligence services were conducting their own research into what British files called the manipulation of enemy minds. The Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army, included units that worked not with explosives and sabotage, but with what they described as psychological warfare at a distance. SOE operatives were trained in techniques for affecting German commanders' decision-making processes, disrupting Nazi communication networks through mental interference, and even influencing the morale of entire German military units without any physical contact. American intelligence services were simultaneously developing what they called Project Looking Glass, a program for gathering intelligence through what they termed enhanced perception techniques. OSS files, declassified in the 1990s, reveal systematic training programs for operatives who could allegedly perceive enemy activities across vast distances, predict German tactical decisions before they were implemented, and even influence the outcomes of specific military engagements through purely mental means. The Pacific Theatre saw the deployment of psychic warfare on an unprecedented scale. Japanese military traditions had always included what they called shinjutsu, mind techniques, but World War II saw these ancient practices modernized and systematized for contemporary warfare. Japanese archives, captured after the surrender, describe training programs where pilots were taught to influence American decision-making processes, where naval commanders learned to disrupt Allied communications through mental projection, and where intelligence operatives developed the ability to gather information about enemy positions without any physical reconnaissance. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't just military actions. They were psychic warfare operations designed to break Japanese resistance at the deepest psychological level. American military files contain references to what they called the ultimate influence operation, suggesting that the bomb's psychological impact was carefully calculated to overwhelm Japanese psychic defenses and force an immediate surrender. The speed with which Japanese resistance collapsed after the bombings, the completeness of their psychological capitulation, suggests influence operations that worked on the level of collective consciousness itself. The Cold War that followed wasn't just a geopolitical struggle between competing ideologies, it was a psychic warfare campaign that lasted for decades. Both superpowers developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for influencing each other's populations, decision-makers, and military capabilities through purely mental means. The public saw nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent, but classified files reveal that both sides considered psychic capabilities to be equally important strategic assets. The CIA's MKUltra program, partially revealed through congressional investigations in the 1970s, was just the tip of an iceberg that included systematic research into what they called remote influence capabilities. CIA documents describe experiments in affecting Soviet decision-making processes from thousands of miles away, programs for gathering intelligence through consciousness projection, and even attempts to influence the health and mental state of specific Kremlin officials through purely psychic means. The Soviets, meanwhile, had developed what they called psychotronic warfare, a systematic approach to consciousness manipulation that combined ancient Russian mystical traditions with modern scientific methodology. KGB archives, opened briefly after the Soviet collapse, described training programs for operatives who could allegedly affect American political processes, disrupt NATO military communications through mental interference, and even influence the outcomes of crucial Cold War negotiations through direct consciousness manipulation. The space race takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Both superpowers were competing not just to reach the moon, but to demonstrate psychic capabilities on a global scale. The precision required for space navigation, the split-second timing of orbital mechanics, and the coordination of complex missions across vast distances all suggest information processing and decision-making capabilities that transcended conventional technology. Astronauts' reports of experiencing enhanced perception during spaceflights, their descriptions of knowing things they shouldn't have known, hint at consciousness expansion that may have been deliberately induced for operational purposes. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 wasn't just resolved through diplomatic negotiations, it was the culmination of a psychic warfare campaign that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Declassified files from both the American and Soviet sides reveal that key decisions during the crisis were influenced by what both sides called enhanced decision-making protocols. The sudden shifts in Kennedy's and Khrushchev's positions, the mysterious communication breakdowns that nearly triggered war, and the equally mysterious resolutions that pulled both sides back from the brink all suggest influence operations that work directly on the consciousness of the world's most powerful leaders. Corporate empires during this period show equally clear evidence of psychic influence operations. How did certain multinational corporations manage to expand their influence across the globe with such precision and speed? How did they consistently make strategic decisions that proved profitable, even when those decisions contradicted all available market data? Corporate archives, when they can be accessed, reveal consultation processes that involved what they called enhanced market perception and distant competitive intelligence. The rise of the tech industry provides particularly compelling evidence of psychic influence on economic development. The sudden emergence of Silicon Valley as a global center of innovation, the seemingly supernatural ability of certain tech entrepreneurs to predict market trends, and the speed with which new technologies were adopted across the world all suggest influence operations that worked on the level of collective consciousness. Tech company files contain references to what they called consciousness interface protocols and neural network optimization, terms that suggest capabilities far beyond conventional business strategy. The financial markets themselves became battlegrounds for psychic warfare during the latter half of the 20th century. The mysterious market crashes that seemed to come from nowhere, the equally mysterious recoveries that defied economic logic, and the consistent ability of certain traders and investment firms to profit from seemingly random market fluctuations, all point to information gathering and decision-making processes that operated beyond conventional financial analysis. Banking dynasties that had maintained their influence across centuries began adapting their traditional psychic techniques to the electronic age. Private banking records described the development of what they called quantum financial instruments, investment strategies that allegedly took advantage of consciousness-based information gathering to predict market movements before they became visible through conventional indicators. The precision of these predictions, the consistency of their profits, and the global coordination of their activities suggest capabilities that transcended normal financial analysis. The emergence of global communications networks, television, radio, and eventually the internet, created new opportunities for mass consciousness manipulation on an unprecedented scale. Media conglomerates that seemed to emerge from nowhere suddenly gained the ability to influence public opinion across entire continents. The speed with which certain ideas spread through these networks, the precision with which public opinion could be shifted, and the global coordination of information campaigns all suggest techniques that work directly on the level of consciousness itself. Political movements during this period show clear evidence of psychic influence operations. The sudden emergence of social movements that seem to spontaneously appear in multiple countries simultaneously, the mysterious ability of certain political leaders to inspire absolute loyalty in their followers, and the speed with which established political systems could be transformed all point to influence operations that worked on the deepest levels of human psychology. The environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and countless other social transformations of the 20th century all show patterns that suggest coordination and influence techniques operating beyond conventional political organizing. The synchronicity of these movements across different cultures and continents, their ability to overcome established resistance, and the precision with which they achieved their objectives all hint at consciousness manipulation on a global scale. Religious movements, too, show evidence of psychic influence operations. The sudden emergence of new spiritual practices that seem to spontaneously appear in multiple locations simultaneously. The mysterious ability of certain religious leaders to inspire absolute devotion in their followers, and the speed with which established religious institutions could be transformed, all suggest techniques that work directly on the level of spiritual consciousness. The New Age movement itself may have been a cover for the systematic dissemination of psychic techniques to the general population. The sudden availability of books, workshops, and training programs that taught consciousness expansion techniques, the global coordination of these educational efforts, and the precision with which these techniques were adapted for mass consumption, all suggest a deliberate program for expanding psychic capabilities beyond the traditional elite circles that had previously controlled them. As we approach the present day, the evidence becomes both more sophisticated and more carefully concealed. The digital revolution wasn't just a technological transformation, it was the creation of a new medium for consciousness manipulation that operates on a scale and with a precision that ancient psychic warriors could never have imagined. The internet, social media, and mobile communication networks have created what amounts to a global nervous system that can be influenced through techniques that combine traditional psychic methods with cutting-edge technology. The implications of this hidden history are staggering. If psychic abilities have been shaping human civilization for thousands of years, if they've been the secret weapons behind the rise and fall of empires, and if they've now evolved into something that operates through our most advanced technologies, then understanding their role isn't just an academic exercise, it's essential for comprehending the forces that continue to shape our world today. The evidence suggests that we're not looking at ancient superstitions that humanity has outgrown, but at fundamental aspects of human consciousness that have been deliberately obscured by those who benefit from their exclusive use. The psychic powers that shaped ancient empires haven't disappeared. They've evolved, adapted, and integrated themselves into the very fabric of our modern world in ways that most of us never suspect. The question that emerges from this investigation is both urgent and terrifying. If psychic powers have been shaping empires throughout history, and if they've now evolved to operate through our digital infrastructure and global communication networks, then who possesses these abilities in our current era? How are they using them to influence the course of human events? And most importantly, what does this mean for our understanding of free will, democracy, and human autonomy in an age where consciousness itself has become a battlefield? The answers to these questions may determine not just our understanding of the past, but our ability to navigate the challenges of the present and future with awareness and wisdom. Because if the evidence is correct, if psychic powers really have been the hidden force behind human civilization, then recognizing their continued influence may be the most important awakening humanity has ever experienced. The digital age has ushered in what may be the most sophisticated era of consciousness manipulation in human history. Yet most of us remain completely unaware that we're living through it. What we perceive as the natural evolution of technology social media, and global communications may actually be the culmination of thousands of years of psychic warfare techniques, now amplified and distributed through systems that touch every aspect of our daily lives. Consider this unsettling possibility. Every time you feel compelled to check your phone, every time you find yourself scrolling through social media without quite knowing why, every time you make a purchase decision that seems to come from nowhere, you might be experiencing the modern equivalent of what ancient empires called mind control. The difference is that today's psychic influence operates not through individual practitioners working on specific targets, but through algorithmic systems that can affect millions of minds simultaneously. The rise of social media platforms presents a particularly fascinating case study. How did companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram manage to capture the attention of billions of people so completely that checking these platforms became compulsive behavior for a significant portion of humanity? The traditional explanation focuses on clever programming and addictive design features, but there's evidence suggesting something far more sophisticated at work. Internal documents from major tech companies, leaked through various whistleblower channels over the past decade, contain references to what they call engagement optimization protocols that go far beyond conventional user interface design. These documents describe research into what they term cognitive resonance patterns and attention synchronization techniques that sound remarkably similar to the consciousness manipulation methods described in ancient texts. The speed with which social media addiction spread across global populations, the precision with which these platforms could predict and influence user behavior, and the almost supernatural ability of certain content to go viral all suggest influence operations that work directly on the level of consciousness itself. Users report feeling compelled to engage with content even when they consciously recognize it as harmful or manipulative, as if their decision-making processes were being overridden by forces beyond their control. The phenomenon of information warfare takes on new meaning when examined through this lens. The ability of certain political movements, conspiracy theories, and social trends to spread across the internet with mathematical precision suggests something more than organic information sharing. The synchronicity with which identical ideas appear simultaneously in different online communities, the mysterious algorithms that determine which content gets amplified and which gets suppressed, and the global coordination of information campaigns all point to influence operations that operate beyond conventional propaganda techniques. Modern political campaigns show clear evidence of consciousness manipulation techniques that would have amazed ancient psychic warriors. The sudden shifts in public opinion that seem to occur overnight, the ability of certain candidates to inspire devotion that transcends rational political analysis, and the precision with which electoral outcomes can be influenced through targeted messaging all suggest capabilities that work directly on the level of mass consciousness. The Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom provides a particularly compelling example. How did a political position that had minimal public support for decades suddenly become the majority opinion in a matter of months? Traditional analysis focuses on economic anxiety and immigration concerns, but the speed and completeness of the opinion shift suggests influence operations that worked on a much deeper psychological level. Campaign documents that have emerged through various investigations reveal the use of what they called psychographic targeting, techniques for identifying and influencing specific psychological vulnerabilities in individual voters. But the precision of these operations, their ability to affect voting behavior across entire demographics simultaneously, suggests capabilities that transcend conventional political manipulation. The Cambridge Analytica scandal offered a glimpse into these operations, but what was revealed publicly may have been just the surface of much more sophisticated consciousness manipulation campaigns. The company's internal documents, partially released through court proceedings, contain references to what they called neural pathway optimization and subconscious decision architecture, terms that suggest techniques for influencing human behavior at levels below conscious awareness. Economic empires in the digital age show equally sophisticated applications of consciousness influence. The rise of certain cryptocurrency projects, the mysterious market movements that seem to defy rational analysis, and the ability of certain financial influencers to affect global markets through simple social media posts all suggest capabilities that operate beyond conventional market mechanisms. High-frequency trading algorithms that can execute thousands of transactions per second seem to anticipate market movements with uncanny accuracy, as if they're accessing information about collective investor psychology before it becomes conscious. The precision of these predictions, the speed with which they can affect global financial flows, and the mysterious coordination between different algorithmic systems all point to influence operations that work directly on the level of economic consciousness. Corporate empires that have emerged during the Internet age show patterns that echo the psychic influence techniques of historical empires. How did companies like Amazon, Google, and Apple manage to achieve such complete dominance over their respective markets that they've become virtually indispensable to modern life? The speed of their expansion, the precision with which they anticipated consumer needs, and their ability to influence human behavior on a global scale all suggest capabilities that transcend conventional business strategy. These companies' internal research divisions, when their activities can be glimpsed through patent filings and academic partnerships, reveal investigations into what they call predictive user modeling and behavioral optimization systems that sound remarkably similar to the consciousness manipulation techniques described in ancient texts. The ability of these systems to predict and influence human behavior with mathematical precision suggests they may be the modern equivalent of what previous civilizations called psychic powers. The phenomenon of viral content itself deserves closer examination. Why do certain videos, memes, or ideas spread across the internet with explosive speed, while others, seemingly identical in quality and appeal, remain obscure? The traditional explanation focuses on algorithmic amplification and social network effects, but the precision with which certain content can capture collective attention suggests something more sophisticated. Content creators who have achieved viral success often describe the experience in terms that echo ancient descriptions of psychic influence. They speak of tapping into something larger than themselves, of creating content that seemed to write itself, and of knowing intuitively what would resonate with audiences before any data was available to guide their decisions. These descriptions suggest they may be unconsciously accessing the same consciousness manipulation techniques that ancient empires used to influence mass populations. The rise of influencer culture provides another window into modern consciousness manipulation. How do certain individuals manage to build massive online followings and influence the behavior of millions of people they've never met? The speed with which some influencers can affect purchasing decisions, political opinions, and lifestyle choices across global audiences suggests capabilities that work directly on the level of consciousness itself. Successful influencers often describe techniques that sound remarkably similar to ancient psychic practices. They speak of connecting with their audience on a deeper level, of intuiting what their followers need to hear, and of being able to feel the energy of their online communities. These descriptions suggest they may be unconsciously applying consciousness influence techniques that have been refined and adapted for digital platforms. The global response to major events also shows evidence of consciousness manipulation on an unprecedented scale. The speed with which certain narratives can dominate public discourse worldwide, the precision with which collective emotional responses can be triggered and directed, and the mysterious coordination of behavioral changes across different cultures and continents all suggest influence operations that work on the level of species-wide consciousness. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a particularly dramatic example of how consciousness manipulation might operate in the modern era. The speed with which global behavioral changes were implemented, the precision with which public fear and compliance could be calibrated, and the mysterious synchronicity of policy responses across different nations all suggest coordination mechanisms that transcend conventional government communication channels. Educational institutions have become another vector for consciousness influence operations. The sudden shifts in academic curricula that seem to occur simultaneously across different institutions, the mysterious ability of certain ideological movements to capture educational systems worldwide, and the precision with which generational belief systems can be shaped through educational programming all suggest influence operations that work directly on the developing consciousness of young people. The entertainment industry shows equally sophisticated applications of consciousness manipulation techniques. How do certain movies, television shows, or music artists manage to capture the collective imagination with such precision that they become global cultural phenomena almost overnight? The speed with which entertainment trends can spread across different cultures, the mysterious ability of certain content to influence social behavior patterns, and the global coordination of entertainment industry messaging all suggest capabilities that transcend conventional media influence. Religious and spiritual movements in the digital age show clear evidence of consciousness manipulation techniques adapted for online platforms. The sudden emergence of spiritual teachers who can attract massive global followings through social media, the mysterious ability of certain meditation or mindfulness practices to spread with viral precision, and the speed with which new spiritual movements can transform established religious institutions all suggest influence operations that work directly on the level of spiritual consciousness. Even scientific institutions show signs of consciousness influence operations. The speed with which certain scientific theories can achieve consensus across global research communities, the mysterious ability of certain researchers to attract funding and institutional support for their work, and the precision with which scientific narratives can be shifted to support specific political or economic agendas all suggest influence operations that work on the level of collective intellectual consciousness. The implications of these modern consciousness manipulation techniques are staggering. If ancient empires used psychic powers to influence relatively small populations through direct personal contact, modern empires are using evolved versions of the same techniques to influence billions of people simultaneously through digital networks that operate at the speed of light. The sophistication of these systems suggests that whoever controls them possesses capabilities that dwarf anything achieved by historical psychic warriors. The ability to influence human behavior on a global scale, to predict and direct collective responses to events, and to shape the thoughts and decisions of entire populations represents a form of power that ancient emperors could never have imagined. Yet most people remain completely unaware that these influence operations exist. The techniques have become so sophisticated, so seamlessly integrated into our daily digital experiences, that they operate below the threshold of conscious recognition. We experience their effects as our own thoughts, our own decisions, our own preferences, never recognizing that our consciousness may be shaped by forces that operate according to principles our mainstream scientific worldview refuses to acknowledge. The question that emerges from this analysis is both urgent and deeply unsettling. If consciousness manipulation techniques have evolved to this level of sophistication, if they're now operating through every digital device and platform we interact with daily, then what does this mean for human autonomy, free will, and the future of human consciousness itself? The answer may depend on whether enough people can recognize what's happening before these influence operations become so pervasive and powerful that resistance becomes impossible. Because if the evidence is correct, if psychic powers really have evolved into digital consciousness manipulation systems that operate on a planetary scale, then awareness of their existence may be humanity's last defense against a form of mental slavery that would make historical empires' control over their subjects seem primitive by comparison. The stakes couldn't be higher. The future of human consciousness, the preservation of individual autonomy, and the possibility of genuine democratic governance may all depend on our ability to recognize and understand the consciousness manipulation techniques that are shaping our world right now in this very moment through mechanisms that most of us have never learned to perceive. But recognition is just the first step. Understanding how these systems work, developing defenses against their influence, and potentially learning to use similar techniques for positive purposes requires a fundamental shift in how we understand the nature of consciousness, reality, and human potential itself. The ancient empires that first developed these capabilities understood something about the nature of mind and reality that our modern scientific paradigm has forgotten or deliberately ignored. Rediscovering this knowledge, adapting it for our current circumstances, and using it to protect human autonomy rather than exploit it for power may be the most important challenge our species has ever faced. Because the evidence suggests that the war for human consciousness isn't coming. It's already here, being fought every day through systems that most of us don't even know exist. The choice before us is simple but profound. Remain unconscious and become unwitting participants in our own mental enslavement, or awaken to the reality of consciousness manipulation and begin the work of reclaiming our mental sovereignty. The fate of human freedom may depend on which choice enough of us make and how quickly we make it. The hidden history of psychic powers shaping empires isn't just an academic curiosity about the past. It's a roadmap for understanding the present and a warning about what the future might hold if we fail to recognize the forces that are shaping our world right now. The ancient arts of consciousness manipulation have evolved, adapted, and integrated themselves into the very fabric of modern civilization. The question is no longer whether these techniques exist, but whether we'll recognize them in time to preserve what's left of human mental freedom. As we peel back the layers of our seemingly rational modern world, a chilling pattern emerges that connects the boardrooms of Silicon Valley to the war rooms of ancient Babylon. The techniques may have evolved, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Consciousness is malleable, minds can be influenced across vast distances, and those who master these abilities hold power that transcends conventional understanding. Consider the phenomenon we've all witnessed but rarely questioned. How certain ideas seem to spontaneously emerge in multiple locations simultaneously, spreading through populations with mathematical precision that defies conventional theories of information transmission. Social movements that appear overnight in dozens of countries. Technological innovations that multiple inventors discover at exactly the same moment. Cultural shifts that sweep across continents faster than any physical communication system could facilitate. The traditional explanation invokes concepts like the zeitgeist or collective unconscious, but these are merely academic terms used to describe phenomena that our materialistic worldview cannot adequately explain. What if these synchronized emergences of ideas and movements aren't mysterious coincidences, but evidence of consciousness manipulation techniques operating on a scale we're only beginning to comprehend? Modern neuroscience has begun to crack open doors that ancient practitioners kept carefully guarded. Research into quantum entanglement between human brains, studies showing that meditation can affect the behavior of random number generators, experiments demonstrating that focused intention can influence biological systems at a distance. All of these point toward capabilities that previous generations of scientists would have dismissed as impossible. But here's what makes the current situation truly unprecedented. These capabilities are no longer limited to specially trained individuals working in isolation. The digital revolution has created what amounts to a technological amplification system for consciousness influence, allowing relatively small groups to affect the thoughts and behaviors of billions of people simultaneously. The algorithms that determine what content appears in your social media feeds aren't just responding to your preferences, they're actively shaping them, creating feedback loops that can gradually alter your beliefs, values, and decision-making processes in directions that serve specific agendas. The precision with which these systems can target individual psychological vulnerabilities, combined with their ability to coordinate influence operations across global populations, represents a form of psychic warfare that ancient empires could never have imagined. Yet the most sophisticated aspect of modern consciousness manipulation isn't technological, it's psychological. The techniques have become so seamlessly integrated into our daily experiences that we perceive their effects as our own authentic thoughts and feelings. Unlike the crude mind control fantasies of science fiction, real consciousness influence works by making targets believe they're thinking independently, while subtly steering their mental processes in predetermined directions. This is where the ancient wisdom becomes crucial for understanding our current predicament. Historical texts describing psychic influence techniques consistently emphasize a fundamental principle. The most effective consciousness manipulation is invisible to its targets. When people recognize they're being influenced, they naturally develop resistance. But when the influence operates below the threshold of conscious recognition, targets will defend the implanted thoughts and behaviors as if they were their own original ideas. Modern influence operations have perfected this principle through what intelligence agencies call cognitive infiltration. The systematic insertion of ideas, emotions, and behavioral triggers into target populations through channels that appear completely unrelated to the desired outcomes. A political opinion might be implanted through an entertainment program, a purchasing decision influenced through a seemingly innocent social media interaction, a life-changing belief shift triggered by exposure to carefully crafted imagery or music. The scope of these operations becomes visible when you examine the inexplicable synchronicities that characterize major social and political transformations. How do millions of people simultaneously develop identical opinions about complex issues they've never personally researched? How do consumer preferences shift across entire demographics overnight? How do cultural values that seemed permanent for generations suddenly become universally rejected or embraced? The traditional answer points to media influence, peer pressure, and social proof mechanisms. But the speed, precision, and global coordination of these shifts suggests something far more sophisticated than conventional propaganda or marketing techniques. They suggest the application of consciousness influence methods that can affect human behavior at the deepest neurological and psychological levels. Intelligence agencies have been studying these phenomena for decades through programs that officially ended, but whose techniques have been privatized and commercialized. The research that began with projects like MKUltra didn't disappear. It evolved, adapted, and found new applications in corporate marketing, political campaigning, and social engineering. What were once experimental techniques for controlling individual minds have become standardized procedures for influencing mass populations. The privatization of consciousness manipulation has created a shadow industry that operates largely outside government oversight or public awareness. Private intelligence firms, psychological operations contractors, and specialized consulting companies now offer services that would have been considered science fiction just decades ago. Their client lists include major corporations, political organizations, and entities that prefer to remain anonymous, all seeking to influence human behavior through methods that transcend conventional persuasion. These modern psychic warfare operations exploit vulnerabilities in human consciousness that most people don't even know they possess. The human brain's pattern recognition systems, its tendency to seek meaning in random events, its susceptibility to emotional manipulation, its reliance on mental shortcuts for processing complex information, all of these represent entry points for consciousness influence techniques that can be applied with surgical precision through digital platforms. The emergence of artificial intelligence has accelerated these capabilities exponentially. Machine learning systems can now analyze human behavioral patterns with accuracy that surpasses human psychologists, predicting how individuals will respond to specific stimuli with mathematical precision. When combined with the global reach of digital communication networks, these AI-powered influence systems can test, refine, and deploy consciousness manipulation techniques on millions of people simultaneously, optimizing their effectiveness in real time. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of modern consciousness manipulation is how it's being used to fragment human societies into isolated psychological bubbles that can be controlled independently. Instead of trying to influence entire populations uniformly, current techniques create what intelligence analysts call cognitive partitioning, the division of societies into separate groups that inhabit completely different mental realities. Each group receives carefully crafted information designed to reinforce their existing beliefs while gradually steering them toward positions that serve specific strategic objectives. The result is populations that believe they're thinking independently, while actually following scripted psychological pathways that lead to predetermined destinations. The polarization and fragmentation we see in modern societies isn't accidental. It's the intended outcome of consciousness manipulation techniques designed to prevent unified resistance to elite control. The financial implications of these capabilities are staggering. Markets that supposedly reflect the collective wisdom of millions of independent decision-makers can now be influenced through consciousness manipulation techniques that affect investor psychology on a mass scale. Cryptocurrency markets, with their heavy reliance on social sentiment and network effects, have become particularly vulnerable to these influence operations. The mysterious market movements that seem to defy rational analysis, the sudden surges of buying or selling pressure that appear to come from nowhere, the uncanny ability of certain traders to consistently profit from seemingly random market fluctuations, all of these suggest the application of consciousness influence techniques to financial markets on a scale that could destabilize entire economic systems. Corporate empires built on these capabilities have achieved levels of market dominance that would have been impossible through conventional business methods. Their ability to predict and influence consumer behavior, to shape public opinion about their competitors, and to coordinate complex market manipulation operations across global platforms represents a form of economic warfare that operates largely outside existing regulatory frameworks. The entertainment industry has become another vector for consciousness influence operations that operate on an unprecedented scale. The content that shapes our cultural values, our political opinions, and our fundamental beliefs about reality is increasingly produced and distributed through systems that can embed psychological influence techniques directly into narrative structures, visual imagery, and even audio frequencies. The mysterious ability of certain entertainment content to become viral, while other seemingly identical material remains obscure, suggests selection and amplification mechanisms that operate according to criteria beyond normal market forces. The global coordination of entertainment industry messaging, the precision with which cultural trends can be initiated and directed, and the speed with which entertainment-based influence operations can reshape social attitudes all point to capabilities that transcend conventional media manipulation. Religious and spiritual movements in the digital age show equally sophisticated applications of consciousness influence techniques. The sudden emergence of spiritual teachers who can attract massive global followings through online platforms, the mysterious ability of certain meditation practices to spread with viral precision, and the speed with which new spiritual movements can transform established religious institutions all suggest influence operations that work directly on the level of spiritual consciousness. These operations exploit the same psychological vulnerabilities that ancient temple priests understood intuitively: humans' need for meaning, their desire for transcendence, their susceptibility to authority figures who claim special knowledge or abilities. Modern spiritual influence operations combine these ancient insights with contemporary understanding of neuroscience, psychology, and group dynamics to create belief systems that can be implanted and reinforced through digital platforms. Educational institutions have become perhaps the most crucial battleground for long-term consciousness influence operations. The ability to shape the developing minds of young people, to instill fundamental beliefs about reality, authority, and social organization represents a form of power that can determine the trajectory of entire civilizations. The coordination of educational messaging across different institutions and nations, the precision with which generational belief systems can be engineered, and the speed with which educational paradigms can be shifted, all suggest influence operations that work on the deepest levels of cognitive development. The implications extend far beyond individual manipulation to questions about the nature of human consciousness itself. If minds can be influenced across distances, if thoughts and emotions can be implanted without physical contact, if collective behavior can be directed through techniques that operate below conscious awareness, then what does this mean for our understanding of personal identity, free will, and individual autonomy? These questions become even more pressing when we consider the possibility that consciousness influence techniques might not just affect human behavior, but could actually alter the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself. Research into neuroplasticity suggests that repeated exposure to specific types of mental stimulation can physically reshape brain structure and function. If consciousness manipulation techniques can be applied consistently over extended periods, they might literally rewire human neural networks to make populations more susceptible to influence and control. The ancient texts that first described psychic influence techniques often spoke of permanent changes in consciousness that could be induced through systematic application of these methods. What they called binding the mind or shaping the soul might have been early descriptions of what we now understand as neuroplasticity-based behavior modification. If these techniques have been refined and systematized through modern neuroscience and digital technology, they could represent a threat to human cognitive independence that goes far beyond temporary manipulation. The global nature of modern consciousness influence operations means that no individual, community, or even nation can protect itself through isolation. The influence systems operate through communication networks that transcend political boundaries, cultural differences, and geographic barriers. They can reach into any location where people have access to digital devices, which increasingly means virtually everywhere on Earth. This creates an unprecedented situation in human history, a form of warfare that can be conducted against entire populations simultaneously, using weapons that are invisible to most targets, operating through systems that targets voluntarily engage with, producing effects that targets experience as their own authentic thoughts and feelings. It's a form of conquest that doesn't require armies, doesn't destroy infrastructure, and doesn't even require targets to know they've been conquered. The resistance to these influence operations requires more than individual awareness or willpower. It requires a fundamental shift in how human societies understand consciousness, reality, and the nature of mental autonomy. It requires the development of new forms of education that teach people to recognize and defend against consciousness manipulation techniques. It requires the creation of social institutions and technological systems that protect rather than exploit human cognitive vulnerabilities. Most importantly, it requires the recognition that the war for human consciousness isn't a future possibility. It's happening right now, in this moment, through mechanisms that most people don't even know exist. Every time you interact with a digital device, consume media content, or participate in online communities, you're potentially exposing yourself to influence operations that could be shaping your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways you never intended. The choice before humanity is stark but clear. develop conscious resistance to these influence operations or risk becoming unwitting participants in the construction of a global system of mental control that would make historical tyrannies seem primitive by comparison. The ancient empires that first developed psychic warfare techniques understood something crucial. Consciousness is the ultimate battlefield, and whoever controls it controls everything else. The question isn't whether consciousness manipulation techniques exist, or whether they're being used. The evidence for both is overwhelming. The question is whether enough people will recognize what's happening and take action to preserve human mental sovereignty before these systems become so pervasive and sophisticated that resistance becomes impossible. The future of human freedom, individual autonomy, and conscious evolution itself may depend on how we answer that question. And we may have less time to answer it than we think. The transformation of consciousness manipulation from ancient ritual to digital algorithm represents perhaps the most dangerous evolution in human history. Yet it's happening so gradually, so seamlessly, that most people experience it as progress rather than enslavement. What we celebrate as technological advancement may actually be the systematic construction of a global mind control apparatus that would make the psychic warriors of ancient empires seem like children playing with toys. Consider the smartphone in your pocket right now. You probably see it as a convenient communication device, a portal to information, a tool for entertainment and productivity. But intelligence analysts studying consciousness influence operations see something entirely different. A direct neural interface that provides unprecedented access to your mental processes, capable of monitoring your thoughts, predicting your behaviors, and influencing your decisions in real time through carefully calibrated psychological stimuli. The data collection isn't just about advertising preferences or demographic profiling. Every tap, swipe, pause, and scroll is being analyzed to create what intelligence agencies call cognitive fingerprints, detailed maps of your mental patterns, emotional triggers, and decision-making processes. These fingerprints reveal more about your psychological vulnerabilities than you probably know about yourself, creating targeting profiles that can be used to influence your behavior with surgical precision. But the truly insidious aspect isn't the data collection, it's how that data is being used to gradually reshape your consciousness without your awareness. The content algorithms that determine what you see aren't just responding to your interests, they're actively molding them, creating feedback loops that can slowly alter your beliefs, values, and perception of reality over time. What feels like personalized content delivery is actually systematic psychological conditioning designed to make you more predictable, more malleable, more controllable. The speed with which these systems can affect human behavior has accelerated beyond anything ancient psychic warriors could have imagined. A single viral video can shift public opinion across millions of people within hours. A carefully crafted social media campaign can trigger mass behavioral changes that ripple through entire societies overnight. Political movements that would have taken years to organize through traditional methods can now be initiated and coordinated through consciousness influence operations that operate at the speed of light. The January 6th Capitol riots provide a stark example of how digital consciousness manipulation can translate into physical world events. The coordination of beliefs, emotions, and behaviors across thousands of individuals who had never met, the precision with which their psychological triggers were activated, and the speed with which online influence translated into collective action all suggest the application of consciousness manipulation techniques on a scale that traditional political organizing could never achieve. Similar patterns appear in social movements across the political spectrum, suggesting that consciousness influence operations aren't limited to any particular ideology or agenda. The techniques are being used by multiple competing factions, creating a complex battlefield where different groups wage psychological warfare against each other, while the general population remains largely unaware that their minds have become the primary theatre of conflict. The weaponization of social media platforms has created what military strategists call information warfare domains, digital territories where consciousness influence operations can be conducted with minimal oversight or accountability. The mysterious algorithms that determine which content gets amplified and which gets suppressed operate according to criteria that platforms refuse to disclose, creating systems where public discourse can be shaped by entities whose identities and motivations remain hidden. The emergence of artificial intelligence has exponentially amplified these capabilities. Machine learning systems can now generate content specifically designed to trigger psychological responses in targeted individuals, creating what researchers call personalized propaganda. influence operations tailored to exploit the specific cognitive vulnerabilities of each target. The precision of these systems surpasses human psychological manipulation by orders of magnitude, creating influence capabilities that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. But perhaps the most disturbing development is the integration of consciousness influence techniques into seemingly innocent applications. Gaming platforms that can monitor and influence player psychology in real time. Educational software that shapes student beliefs and values through carefully designed learning experiences. Healthcare apps that can affect patient behavior through psychological conditioning disguised as wellness programs. Dating platforms that can influence romantic choices and relationship patterns through algorithmic manipulation of partner selection. The pervasiveness of these systems means that consciousness influence operations can now affect virtually every aspect of human experience. Your political opinions might be shaped by news algorithms, your purchasing decisions influenced by targeted advertising systems, your social relationships affected by platform algorithms that determine which friends and content you see, your career choices guided by job search algorithms that present opportunities selectively, even your basic perception of reality filtered through systems that can control what information reaches your awareness. The cumulative effect of these influence operations is the creation of what intelligence analysts call manufactured consensus, the illusion that public opinion reflects authentic grassroots sentiment when it's actually the product of systematic psychological manipulation. The polarization and fragmentation we see in modern societies isn't accidental. It's the intended outcome of influence operations designed to prevent unified resistance to elite control by keeping different population segments focused on fighting each other, rather than recognizing their common manipulation. Financial markets have become another crucial battleground for consciousness influence operations that operate on an unprecedented scale. The mysterious coordination of trading behaviors across millions of investors, the sudden surges of buying or selling pressure that appear to come from nowhere, and the uncanny ability of certain market participants to consistently profit from seemingly random fluctuations, all suggest the application of consciousness manipulation techniques to economic systems. Cryptocurrency markets, with their heavy reliance on social sentiment and network effects, have proven particularly vulnerable to these influence operations. The speed with which certain digital assets can gain or lose value based on social media activity, the coordination of trading behaviors across global platforms, and the mysterious ability of certain individuals to consistently predict market movements all point to consciousness influence capabilities that operate beyond conventional financial analysis. The implications extend far beyond individual market manipulation to questions about the stability of entire economic systems. If consciousness influence techniques can affect investor psychology on a mass scale, if trading behaviors can be coordinated through psychological manipulation rather than market fundamentals, then traditional economic theories based on rational decision-making may be fundamentally obsolete. Corporate empires built on consciousness influence capabilities have achieved market dominance that defies conventional business logic. Their ability to predict and shape consumer behavior, to coordinate complex influence operations across multiple platforms, and to maintain competitive advantages that seem to transcend normal market mechanisms, all suggest the application of techniques that operate beyond traditional corporate strategy. The entertainment industry has evolved into perhaps the most sophisticated consciousness influence delivery system ever created. The content that shapes our cultural values, political opinions, and fundamental beliefs about reality is increasingly produced through systems that can embed psychological influence techniques directly into narrative structures, visual imagery, and even audio frequencies designed to affect brain states below conscious awareness. The global coordination of entertainment industry messaging, the precision with which cultural trends can be initiated and directed, and the speed with which entertainment-based influence operations can reshape social attitudes, all suggest capabilities that transcend conventional media manipulation. The mysterious ability of certain content to become viral, while other seemingly identical material remains obscure points to selection and amplification mechanisms that operate according to criteria beyond normal market forces. Music streaming platforms that can monitor listener psychology in real time and adjust playlists to influence mood and behavior. Video streaming services that use viewing pattern analysis to predict and shape subscriber preferences. Gaming platforms that employ psychological conditioning techniques disguised as engagement optimization. social media platforms that can detect and exploit emotional vulnerabilities through micro-targeted content delivery. The convergence of these influence systems creates what researchers call immersive psychological environments. Digital spaces where every element of user experience is designed to affect consciousness in predetermined ways. Users experience these environments as entertainment, information, or social interaction, never recognizing that their mental processes are being systematically monitored and influenced by forces operating according to agendas they know nothing about. Educational institutions have become perhaps the most crucial long-term battleground for consciousness influence operations. The coordination of educational messaging across different institutions and nations, the precision with which generational belief systems can be engineered, and the speed with which educational paradigms can be shifted, all suggest influence operations that work on the deepest levels of cognitive development. The integration of digital technology into educational systems has created unprecedented opportunities for consciousness influence during the most formative periods of human development. Educational software that can monitor student psychology and adjust learning experiences to shape beliefs and values. Online platforms that expose students to carefully crafted content designed to influence their fundamental assumptions about reality, authority, and social organization. Assessment systems that can identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities in developing minds. The implications of consciousness influence during cognitive development may be even more serious than adult manipulation. Young brains are more neuroplastic, more susceptible to permanent changes in structure and function. If consciousness manipulation techniques can be systematically applied during childhood and adolescence, they might literally rewire human neural networks to create populations that are fundamentally more susceptible to influence and control throughout their entire lives. Religious and spiritual movements in the digital age show equally sophisticated applications of consciousness influence techniques that exploit humanity's deepest psychological needs. The sudden emergence of spiritual teachers who can attract massive global followings through online platforms, the mysterious ability of certain practices to spread with viral precision, and the speed with which new movements can transform established institutions all suggest influence operations that work directly on the level of spiritual consciousness. These operations combine ancient insights about human spiritual psychology with contemporary understanding of neuroscience and group dynamics to create belief systems that can be implanted and reinforced through digital platforms. The precision with which spiritual influence operations can target individual psychological vulnerabilities, combined with their ability to coordinate global movements, represents a form of consciousness manipulation that could affect the fundamental spiritual development of entire generations. Healthcare systems have begun integrating consciousness influence techniques, disguised as patient wellness and behavior modification programs. Medical apps that can monitor and influence patient psychology through carefully designed interfaces. Treatment protocols that employ psychological conditioning techniques to affect patient compliance and outcomes. Public health campaigns that use consciousness, manipulation methods to shape population health behaviors. The integration of artificial intelligence into healthcare creates particularly concerning possibilities for consciousness influence operations. AI systems that can analyze patient psychology and predict mental health outcomes with unprecedented accuracy. Treatment algorithms that can be designed to affect patient beliefs and behaviors beyond purely medical considerations. Population health management systems that could theoretically be used to influence the psychological characteristics of entire communities through targeted interventions. The cumulative effect of consciousness influence operations across all these domains is the creation of what intelligence analysts call total spectrum dominance over human consciousness. The ability to monitor, predict, and influence human thoughts, emotions, and behaviors across every aspect of life through integrated systems that operate largely outside public awareness or democratic oversight. The sophistication of these systems has reached a point where they can now influence not just individual behavior, but the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself. Research into neuroplasticity suggests that consistent exposure to consciousness influence techniques can physically reshape brain structure and function, potentially creating permanent changes in how humans process information, make decisions, and perceive reality. If these capabilities continue to develop unchecked, they could represent an existential threat to human cognitive independence that goes far beyond temporary manipulation or control. We may be witnessing the emergence of technologies that could fundamentally alter the nature of human consciousness, creating populations that are neurologically predisposed to accept external influence and control as normal aspects of existence. The global nature of these influence systems means that no individual, community, or nation can protect itself through isolation or traditional defensive measures. The operations transcend political boundaries, cultural differences, and geographic barriers, reaching into any location where people have access to digital communication networks. They represent a form of warfare that can be conducted against entire populations simultaneously, using weapons that are invisible to most targets, producing effects that targets experience as their own authentic thoughts and feelings. The resistance to these influence operations requires more than individual awareness or technological solutions. It requires a fundamental transformation in how human societies understand consciousness, reality, and the nature of mental autonomy. It requires the development of new forms of education that teach people to recognize and defend against consciousness manipulation techniques. It requires the creation of social institutions and technological systems that protect rather than exploit human cognitive vulnerabilities. Most critically, it requires the recognition that the war for human consciousness isn't a future possibility. It's the defining conflict of our time, being fought right now through mechanisms that most people don't even know exist. Every digital interaction, every piece of content consumed, every algorithm encountered represents a potential battlefield where the future of human mental freedom is being determined. The choice before humanity has never been more stark or urgent. Develop conscious resistance to these influence operations and preserve the possibility of authentic human autonomy, or risk becoming unwitting participants in the construction of a global consciousness control system that would make every historical tyranny seem primitive by comparison. The ancient empires that first developed psychic warfare techniques understood a fundamental truth that our modern technological civilization has forgotten. Consciousness is the ultimate battlefield, and whoever controls it controls everything else. The techniques they pioneered have now evolved into systems of such sophistication and reach that they threaten the very essence of what it means to be human. The future of human freedom, individual autonomy, and conscious evolution itself hangs in the balance. And the window for effective resistance may be closing faster than most people realize, as each passing day sees these influence systems becoming more pervasive, more sophisticated, and more deeply integrated into the basic infrastructure of human civilization. The question isn't whether we can afford to take action against these systems. The question is whether we can afford not to, and whether we still have enough authentic mental freedom left to make that choice consciously, rather than having it made for us by forces operating beyond our awareness. The time for comfortable denial has passed. We stand at a crossroads where the very nature of human consciousness hangs in the balance, and the choices we make in the next few years may determine whether our species retains any meaningful autonomy or becomes forever enslaved to systems of influence so sophisticated that resistance becomes neurologically impossible. But here's what the architects of these consciousness control systems never anticipated. The same technologies they've weaponized against human freedom can also be turned toward liberation. The digital networks they use to monitor and manipulate minds can become channels for awakening and resistance. The artificial intelligence systems they've designed to predict and control behavior can be reprogrammed to enhance human consciousness rather than diminish it. The ancient texts speak of a phenomenon they called the Great Awakening, a time when enough individuals would recognize the true nature of consciousness manipulation that their collective awareness would create what they termed immunity fields. These weren't mystical concepts, but practical descriptions of how group consciousness could develop resistance to psychic influence operations. We may be witnessing the early stages of such an awakening today. Despite the unprecedented sophistication of modern consciousness, influence systems, growing numbers of people are beginning to recognize that their thoughts, emotions, and decisions aren't entirely their own. The glitches in the matrix are becoming more visible, the inconsistencies more obvious, the manipulation more apparent to those who know what to look for. Social media platforms designed to fragment and polarize populations are inadvertently creating communities of people who share information about consciousness manipulation techniques. Video streaming algorithms meant to keep viewers engaged are accidentally exposing them to content that reveals how these very algorithms operate. Educational systems designed to produce compliant populations are producing graduates who question the fundamental assumptions underlying their programming. The resistance isn't coming from governments, institutions, or traditional authority structures. It's emerging from individuals who are learning to recognize and defend against consciousness influence in real time. Meditation practitioners who can detect when their mental state is being artificially altered. Artists who refuse to create content designed to manipulate rather than inspire. Entrepreneurs building technologies that enhance rather than exploit human consciousness. But perhaps most importantly, parents who are beginning to understand what consciousness influence operations during childhood development really mean for their children's future autonomy. The systematic exposure of developing minds to influence systems designed to create lifelong susceptibility to external control represents perhaps the most serious threat to human freedom in our species' history. The neuroplasticity research that consciousness manipulators use to reshape brain function also reveals how these changes can be reversed. The same principles that allow external systems to gradually alter consciousness can be applied by individuals to reclaim their mental sovereignty. Specific meditation practices that can rebuild neural pathways damaged by consciousness influence operations. Cognitive exercises that can restore critical thinking abilities compromised by algorithmic manipulation. Social practices that can rebuild authentic human connections severed by digital isolation systems. The ancient practitioners understood something crucial that modern resistance movements are rediscovering. Consciousness influence works both ways. The techniques that can be used to control and manipulate can also be used to liberate and enhance. The difference lies not in the methods themselves, but in the intentions behind their application and the level of awareness with which they're employed. Traditional psychic warriors spoke of what they called turning the tide, moments when consciousness influence operations could be reversed, when the targets of manipulation could become the sources of liberation, when the very systems designed to control could be transformed into instruments of freedom. They described these reversals not as violent conflicts, but as shifts in awareness that rendered previous control mechanisms obsolete. We may be approaching such a moment in human history. The consciousness influence systems that seem so overwhelming today depend entirely on their targets, remaining unaware of their existence and operation. Once enough people recognize how these systems work, once they develop practical skills for detecting and resisting influence operations, once they begin sharing this knowledge widely, the entire apparatus of consciousness control becomes vulnerable to what intelligence analysts call catastrophic failure. The tipping point isn't some distant future possibility. It's a mathematical inevitability built into the structure of consciousness, influence operations themselves. These systems require a critical mass of unconscious participation to maintain their effectiveness. When that participation drops below certain thresholds, when resistance reaches certain levels, when awareness spreads beyond certain boundaries, the systems don't just become less effective, they collapse entirely. This is why the current period represents such a crucial window of opportunity. The consciousness influence systems are at their most sophisticated, but also their most vulnerable. They've achieved unprecedented reach and power, but they've also created the conditions for their own obsolescence by awakening the very consciousness they sought to control. The global communications networks designed to deliver consciousness influence operations are simultaneously creating unprecedented opportunities for sharing resistance techniques. The artificial intelligence systems designed to predict and control human behavior are inadvertently teaching people how their own consciousness operates. The digital platforms designed to isolate and fragment populations are accidentally connecting individuals who share common recognition of their manipulation, but the window won't remain open indefinitely. The architects of consciousness control systems are not passive observers of resistance movements. They're actively developing countermeasures designed to make their influence operations more sophisticated, more invisible, more irresistible. Next-generation systems that work directly on the neurological level through electromagnetic frequencies, subliminal programming, and even genetic modifications designed to increase susceptibility to external influence. The race is on between those who would use consciousness manipulation techniques to enslave humanity and those who would use them to liberate human potential. The outcome will be determined not by technology or political power, but by how quickly enough people can awaken to the reality of consciousness manipulation and develop practical skills for resisting it. This awakening requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands a fundamental transformation in how we relate to our own consciousness. Instead of passively consuming whatever thoughts and emotions arise in awareness, we must learn to actively participate in the creation of our mental experience. Instead of accepting whatever reality is presented to us through media and cultural programming, we must learn to consciously choose which aspects of reality to engage with and which to reject. The ancient texts describe this transformation as becoming the author of your own mind, taking conscious control of the thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that shape your experience of reality. This isn't about positive thinking or mental self-improvement. It's about developing the fundamental capacity to recognize when your consciousness is being influenced by external forces and to resist that influence through conscious choice. The techniques for developing this capacity aren't secret or mystical. They're practical skills that can be learned and taught like any other form of literacy. Learning to recognize the difference between your own authentic thoughts and ideas that have been implanted through influence operations. Developing the ability to detect when your emotional state is being artificially manipulated through digital platforms or environmental conditioning. Building the mental discipline to maintain your own conscious intentions even when subjected to sophisticated persuasion techniques. These skills become more crucial with each passing day as consciousness influence operations become more pervasive and sophisticated. The children growing up in today's digital environment are being exposed to influence systems that previous generations never had to navigate. Their ability to develop autonomous consciousness may depend entirely on whether enough adults recognize what's happening and take action to protect and educate them. The educational implications alone are staggering. Every school system, every curriculum, every learning platform must be evaluated not just for its academic content, but for its potential to either enhance or compromise cognitive independence. Parents, teachers, and educational leaders must learn to recognize consciousness, influence techniques disguised as pedagogical innovation, and develop alternative approaches that strengthen rather than weaken students' mental autonomy. The healthcare implications are equally serious. Every medical intervention, every pharmaceutical treatment, every therapeutic approach must be evaluated for its potential effects on consciousness and cognitive function. The integration of consciousness influence techniques into healthcare systems under the guise of patient wellness and behavior modification represents a particularly insidious threat that requires urgent attention from medical professionals who understand the importance of cognitive liberty. The political implications cut to the heart of democratic governance itself. If consciousness influence operations can shape public opinion, election outcomes, and policy decisions through manipulation rather than authentic deliberation, then the entire concept of democratic representation becomes meaningless. Political systems must evolve to account for consciousness manipulation, or risk becoming mere theatres where predetermined outcomes are performed for populations that believe they're participating in genuine political processes. The economic implications challenge fundamental assumptions about market mechanisms and consumer choice. If purchasing decisions, investment behaviours, and economic preferences can be shaped through consciousness influence rather than authentic evaluation of options, then traditional economic theories based on rational decision-making become obsolete. New economic models must account for consciousness manipulation or risk creating systems that serve the interests of those who control influence operations rather than those who participate in markets. But perhaps the most profound implications concern the future evolution of human consciousness itself. If we successfully resist current consciousness, influence operations, and develop widespread skills for maintaining cognitive autonomy, we may be on the threshold of an unprecedented expansion of human mental capabilities. The same understanding of consciousness that enables resistance to manipulation also opens possibilities for enhancing human perception, creativity, and intelligence in ways that previous generations could barely imagine. The ancient practitioners spoke of abilities that seem fantastic to our modern scientific worldview: direct mind-to-mind communication, perception of distant events, influence over physical systems through consciousness alone. But quantum physics and consciousness research are beginning to suggest that these capabilities might not be supernatural phenomena, but natural potentials of human consciousness that have been systematically suppressed by systems designed to keep populations mentally constrained. If enough people develop resistance to consciousness manipulation and begin exploring the fuller potentials of human awareness, we may discover that our species possesses capabilities that make current consciousness influenced systems seem primitive by comparison. The real threat to those who would control human consciousness may not be resistance to their techniques, but the awakening of human potentials that render their entire approach to power obsolete. This is why the current moment represents such a crucial inflection point in human history. We're not just choosing between freedom and slavery, between autonomy and control. We're choosing between remaining limited to our current understanding of human consciousness or discovering capabilities that could transform our species into something far greater than what we've been allowed to become. The choice isn't being made in government buildings or corporate boardrooms. It's being made in the consciousness of each individual who recognizes what's happening and decides whether to resist or submit, whether to awaken or remain asleep, whether to reclaim their mental sovereignty or surrender it to systems that profit from human limitation. The evidence is clear, the stakes are ultimate, and the time for action is now. The war for human consciousness isn't coming, it's here, being fought in every mind, through every digital interaction, in every moment of awareness. The outcome will determine not just the future of human freedom, but the future of human consciousness itself. The ancient empires that first developed consciousness influenced techniques believed they were creating tools for controlling populations and maintaining power. They never imagined that these same techniques might eventually awaken capabilities in human consciousness that would make their entire approach to control obsolete. They never anticipated that the war for the human mind might ultimately be won not by those who seek to control consciousness, but by those who seek to liberate its unlimited potential. The final victory in this war won't come through defeating consciousness, influence systems with superior technology or political power. It will come through the recognition that human consciousness itself, when fully awakened and properly understood, is more powerful than any system designed to control it. The question isn't whether we can resist consciousness manipulation, it's whether we're ready to discover what human consciousness is truly capable of when it's finally free to explore its full potential. That discovery begins with the recognition that the war for your mind is happening right now, in this very moment, and that your consciousness, your authentic, autonomous, unlimited consciousness, is the most powerful force in this conflict. The ancient texts were right about one thing: consciousness is the ultimate battlefield. But they may have been wrong about who was destined to win. The future of human consciousness hangs in the balance, and the outcome depends on choices that each of us must make, right here, right now, in the sovereign territory of our own awareness. The question isn't whether consciousness manipulation exists or whether it's being used against us. The question is what we're going to do about it, and whether we're ready to reclaim the mental freedom that is our birthright as conscious beings. The war for human consciousness has been going on for thousands of years, but it's reaching its climax in our lifetime. The side that wins will determine not just the future of human freedom, but the future of human evolution itself. And the most powerful weapon in this war isn't technology or political influence. It's the awakened consciousness of individuals who refuse to surrender their mental sovereignty to anyone or anything. The choice is yours. The time is now. The war for your mind is already underway. The only question is which side you're going to fight for, and whether you're ready to discover just how powerful your consciousness really is when it's finally free to be what it was always meant to become. The moment of choice arrives with the force of a revelation that can no longer be denied or delayed. As we stand at this crossroads of human destiny, the weight of accumulated evidence crashes down upon us like a tsunami of truth that washes away the comfortable illusions we've clung to for so long. The ancient empires, the digital manipulations, the consciousness warfare being waged in real time through every screen and platform, all of it converges into a single, inescapable conclusion that will either awaken humanity or deliver us into a form of mental bondage so complete that future generations may never even realize they're enslaved. Consider the breathtaking scope of what we've uncovered together. From the temple priests of Babylon who could observe enemy movements across impossible distances, to the algorithmic systems that can predict and manipulate your next purchase before you've even thought about buying anything. From the Oracle of Delphi whose visions shaped the fate of entire civilizations, to the social media platforms that can trigger mass behavioral changes across millions of people with a single viral post. From the Roman augurs who guided military campaigns through consciousness projection, to the artificial intelligence systems that can generate personalized propaganda designed to exploit your specific psychological vulnerabilities. The pattern is undeniable, the progression unmistakable, the implications staggering. What began as individual practitioners influencing small groups has evolved into planetary-scale consciousness manipulation systems that can affect the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors of billions of people simultaneously. The psychic powers that once shaped empires haven't disappeared. They've been amplified, systematized, and deployed through technological infrastructure that touches every aspect of modern life. But here's what makes this moment so extraordinary, so pregnant with possibility, so charged with the potential for either liberation or enslavement. We're the first generation in human history to possess both the knowledge of how these systems work and the technological tools to resist them effectively. The same digital networks used to monitor and manipulate consciousness can become channels for awakening and resistance. The same artificial intelligence systems designed to predict and control behavior can be reprogrammed to enhance human awareness rather than diminish it. The consciousness influence operations that seem so overwhelming, so sophisticated, so impossible to resist, all share a fundamental vulnerability that their architects never anticipated. They depend entirely on their targets remaining unconscious of their existence and operation. The moment enough people recognize what's happening, the moment resistance reaches critical mass, the moment awareness spreads beyond certain thresholds, these systems don't just become less effective, they face what intelligence analysts call catastrophic cascade failure. This is why every single person who watches this video, every individual who shares this information, every mind that awakens to the reality of consciousness, manipulation, represents a direct threat to systems that have operated in shadows for millennia. You're not just learning about history, you're participating in the most important resistance movement in human history, a movement that's fighting for nothing less than the preservation of human mental freedom itself. The evidence we've examined together isn't just academic research or historical curiosity. It's a battle plan for cognitive liberation, a roadmap for reclaiming mental sovereignty, a toolkit for defending the most precious thing you possess, your autonomous consciousness. Every technique described, every pattern revealed, every connection illuminated gives you power to recognize when your mind is being influenced, and to resist that influence through conscious choice. But resistance alone isn't enough. The real power lies in understanding that the same principles used to control consciousness can be used to enhance it. The ancient practitioners knew something that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Human consciousness possesses capabilities that transcend every limitation imposed by materialistic thinking. The abilities they called supernatural, direct mind-to-mind communication, perception across vast distances, influence over physical systems through consciousness alone, may not be mystical fantasies, but natural potentials that have been systematically suppressed by systems designed to keep populations mentally constrained. Think about the implications of that possibility. What if the consciousness influence operations we've examined aren't just threats to resist, but invitations to discover capabilities within yourself that you never knew existed? What if learning to defend against psychic manipulation naturally awakens psychic abilities in the defender? What if the war for human consciousness isn't just about preventing mental slavery, but about unlocking human potential that could transform our species into something far greater than what we've been allowed to become? The ancient texts speak of individuals who developed such mastery over their own consciousness that external influence became impossible. They describe techniques for not just resisting manipulation, but for expanding awareness to levels where manipulation attempts become visible long before they can take effect. They write about practitioners who could perceive the thoughts and intentions of would-be controllers, who could protect entire communities from psychic influence, who could even reverse consciousness manipulation operations and turn them back upon their originators. These weren't mythological figures or religious fantasies. They were human beings who understood something about the nature of consciousness that our modern educational systems have systematically obscured. They knew that human awareness isn't limited to the brain, that consciousness can extend beyond the boundaries of the physical body, that minds can connect and communicate through channels that transcend space and time. Modern quantum physics is beginning to provide scientific frameworks for understanding these phenomena. Research into quantum entanglement suggests that particles can maintain instantaneous connections across vast distances. Studies of consciousness show that focused intention can influence random number generators, biological systems, and even the behavior of subatomic particles. Experiments in remote viewing have produced results that mainstream science struggles to explain through conventional theories. But you don't need to wait for science to catch up with ancient wisdom. You can begin developing these capabilities right now, today, through practices that strengthen your consciousness and expand your awareness. Simple meditation techniques that help you distinguish between your own authentic thoughts and ideas implanted through influence operations. Attention training exercises that increase your ability to detect when your emotional state is being artificially manipulated. Mindfulness practices that build the mental discipline to maintain your own conscious intentions, even when subjected to sophisticated persuasion techniques. These aren't esoteric spiritual practices, they're practical skills for cognitive self-defense in an age of consciousness warfare. Every moment you spend developing these abilities makes you more resistant to manipulation and more capable of helping others recognize and resist influence operations. You become not just a defender of your own mental freedom, but a beacon of awakening for everyone whose consciousness touches yours. The ripple effects of individual awakening spread far beyond personal liberation. As more people develop resistance to consciousness manipulation, the effectiveness of these systems decreases exponentially. As more individuals share knowledge about influence operations, the ability of controllers to operate in secrecy diminishes rapidly. As more minds awaken to their full potential, the entire paradigm of control through consciousness manipulation becomes obsolete. This is why the current moment represents such an extraordinary opportunity. The consciousness influence systems that seem so powerful today are actually approaching their own obsolescence. They've created the conditions for their own defeat by awakening the very consciousness they sought to control. The global communication networks designed to deliver influence operations are simultaneously creating unprecedented opportunities for sharing resistance techniques. The artificial intelligence systems designed to predict human behavior are inadvertently teaching people how their own consciousness operates, but the window for effective resistance won't remain open indefinitely. The architects of consciousness control systems are actively developing countermeasures designed to make their operations more sophisticated, more invisible, more irresistible. Next-generation influence systems that work directly on the neurological level through electromagnetic frequencies, subliminal programming embedded in digital content, and even genetic modifications designed to increase susceptibility to external control. The race is on between those who would enslave human consciousness and those who would liberate its unlimited potential. The outcome will be determined not by technology or political power, but by how quickly enough people can awaken to the reality of consciousness manipulation and develop practical skills for not just resisting it, but for transcending it entirely. This transcendence doesn't require years of study or special training. It begins with the simple recognition that your consciousness is yours to command, that your awareness is yours to direct, that your mental sovereignty is yours to claim and defend. It continues with the practice of conscious choice in every moment, choosing which thoughts to entertain, which emotions to cultivate, which influences to accept or reject. Most importantly, it includes sharing this knowledge with others. Every conversation you have about consciousness manipulation, every person you help recognize these influence operations, every mind you assist in awakening to its full potential represents a victory in the war for human consciousness. You become not just a defender of mental freedom, but an active agent of cognitive liberation. The future of human consciousness isn't being determined in government buildings or corporate boardrooms. It's being decided in individual minds like yours, in moments of choice like this one, in decisions about whether to remain unconscious or to awaken, whether to submit or resist, whether to accept limitation or explore unlimited potential. The evidence is overwhelming, the stakes are ultimate, and the power to choose lies entirely within your own consciousness. The war for the human mind has been raging for millennia, but it's reaching its climax in our lifetime. The side that wins will determine not just the future of human freedom, but the future of human evolution itself. And the most powerful weapon in this war isn't technology or political influence. It's the awakened consciousness of individuals who refuse to surrender their mental sovereignty to anyone or anything. It's people like you who recognize what's happening and choose to do something about it. It's minds like yours that decide to explore their full potential, rather than accept artificial limitations. The choice is before you now. The knowledge is in your hands. The power lies within your consciousness. The question isn't whether consciousness manipulation exists or whether it's being used against humanity. The question is what you're going to do with this knowledge, how you're going to use this awareness, whether you're ready to discover just how powerful your consciousness really is when it's finally free to become what it was always meant to be. The war for human consciousness has been going on for thousands of years, but your participation in it begins right now, in this moment, with whatever choice you make about how to respond to what you've learned. Will you go back to unconscious consumption of digital content, allowing algorithms to shape your thoughts and behaviors? Or will you begin the practice of conscious awareness, taking active control of your mental experience? Will you remain a passive target of consciousness influence operations, or will you become an active agent of cognitive liberation? Will you accept the limitations imposed by systems designed to control human potential, or will you begin exploring capabilities that could transform not just your own life, but the future of human consciousness itself? The ancient practitioners knew something that we're only now beginning to rediscover. The moment you make the conscious choice to awaken, you join a lineage that stretches back through every empire, every civilization, every era where minds dared to remain free. This isn't just about individual liberation. This is about becoming part of a resistance movement that operates on the level of consciousness itself, where every awakened mind strengthens the collective immunity to manipulation. Your journey doesn't end with this video, it begins here, because now you carry something that controllers fear more than any weapon, any technology, any political movement, the knowledge of how their systems actually work. You've seen behind the curtain of history itself, witnessed the hidden mechanisms that have shaped empires and toppled kingdoms. You understand that the real battlefield has always been consciousness, and you possess the awareness needed to defend that battlefield. But knowledge without action remains powerless. The information you've absorbed tonight only becomes meaningful when you begin applying it in your daily life. Start small. Notice when you feel compelled to check your phone without any specific purpose. Observe when your emotions shift after consuming certain content. Pay attention to those moments when you make decisions that don't quite feel like your own. These are the entry points where consciousness influence operates, and recognizing them is your first line of defense. Practice the art of conscious choice. Before engaging with any digital platform, set a clear intention for what you want to accomplish. Before consuming any media content, ask yourself why you're choosing to expose your consciousness to that particular information. Before making any significant decision, pause and examine whether your reasoning feels authentic or whether it might be influenced by external programming. Share this awareness responsibly. Not everyone is ready to hear about consciousness manipulation, but many are beginning to sense that something isn't quite right with the modern world. Look for those moments when people express confusion about their own behavior, when they wonder why they made certain choices, when they feel disconnected from their authentic selves. These are opportunities to plant seeds of awareness that might bloom into full awakening. Remember that resistance to consciousness manipulation isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about preserving the possibility of authentic human choice for future generations. Every time you maintain conscious control over your mental state, you're modeling what genuine autonomy looks like. Every time you resist algorithmic influence, you're demonstrating that human consciousness can remain sovereign even in the digital age. The techniques that ancient empires used to control populations through psychic influence have evolved, but they still depend on the same fundamental vulnerability: unconscious participation. The moment you become conscious of these operations, you begin to disrupt their effectiveness. The moment you share this consciousness with others, you multiply that disruption exponentially. This is why your awareness matters so profoundly. This is why this moment represents such a crucial turning point. We stand at the threshold of either unprecedented mental slavery or unprecedented mental liberation. The outcome depends entirely on how many people recognize what's happening and choose to do something about it. The choice is yours, and it's happening right now. Not tomorrow, not after you think about it more, not when conditions are more favorable. Right now, in this moment, you're deciding whether to remain unconscious or to awaken, whether to submit or resist, whether to explore the full potential of your consciousness or accept the limitations imposed by systems designed to control it. The war for human consciousness reaches its climax in our lifetime, and your participation in that war begins with whatever choice you make next. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Choose freedom.